Good afternoon, everyone. Happy Sabbath. I would just have a short message that I would like to share that I feel God has placed on my heart. Um, it's a very powerful idea, it's a very powerful truth that if you understand this truth, it will unlock the entire plan of salvation. And especially in the time that we are living in now with the coronavirus, I believe that God is revealing His Word and revealing depths to His Word that applies especially to this end time that we are living in, to prepare our people to meet Him when He comes in the clouds of glory. The message is basically regarding the two covenants. You know, there's the Old Covenant and the New Covenant spoken of in the Bible. And I'd like to read to you from Hebrews chapter 8 and verse 9. It says, "Not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day when I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt." So here God says that He made a covenant with His people Israel when He led them out of Egypt. And that was that He gave them through Moses He gave them specific laws that they had to keep in order for them to be His people. But now let's carry on reading. It says, to lead them out of the land of Egypt, because they continued not in my covenant, and I regarded them not, saith the Lord. So here we see that the old covenant was a covenant that God made with the Israelite nation, saying that if you do these things, you will be blessed. But they didn't do it, so they were not blessed. So that is the old covenant, where God made a covenant with the people of Israel and said, do these things and you will live. But they didn't do it. So God made a new covenant. And we read about that in Hebrews chapter 8 verses 10. "For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days." So in other words, He's saying they didn't keep the old covenant, now I'm making a new covenant. He says, "Saith the Lord, I will put my laws into their mind and write them in their hearts, and I will be to them a God, and they shall be unto me a people." So now God says the old covenant they didn't keep, so I'm making a new covenant where they will keep my laws, because I will write my laws into their heart and into their minds. So here we see that God is writing the law that the previous covenant the Israelite nation refused to keep, but now He is doing a new covenant where they will keep the covenant. But now look at Hebrews chapter 10 verses 1. It says, "For the law, having a shadow of good things to come, and not the very image of the things, can never with those sacrifices which they offered year by year continually make the comers thereunto perfect." So we see that in the old covenant, the covenant was supposed to make the comers unto this covenant perfect, but it didn't. And the reason for that is, just pay attention to the text. It says, "For the law, having a shadow of good things to come, and not the very image of the things, can never with those sacrifices which they offered year by year continually make the comers thereunto perfect." So what prevented the comers thereunto, the comers who came unto God, what prevented them from being made perfect was not the law, it was those sacrifices which they offered year by year continually that could not make them perfect. So listen to, so in other words, Hebrews chapter 10 verses 3 and 4, listen to what it says. "But in those sacrifices," so God is referring to the sacrifices, "there is a remembrance again made of sins every year. For it is not possible that the blood of bulls and goats should take away sins." So when we regard the old covenant and we regard the new covenant in the Christian dispensation, we see that the old covenant had to do with the blood of bulls and goats, and the new covenant, listen to what the new covenant has to do with in terms of the sacrifices. It says, Hebrews chapter 10 verses 11 and 14, it says, And every priest standeth daily ministering and offering oftentimes the same sacrifices, referring to the bulls and goats, which can never take away sins. But this man, referring to Jesus, says, after he had offered one sacrifice for sins forever, sat down on the right hand of God. From henceforth expecting till his enemies be made his footstool. For by one offering he hath perfected forever them that are sanctified. So we see that the whole purpose of God's covenant from the Old Testament up until the New Testament was the perfecting of God's people. And the Old Covenant could not do it because they offered the blood of bulls and goats and lambs that could not take away sin. But when Jesus came and he offered himself a sinless being, here Hebrews says that sacrifice could take away their sins and it could present them perfect forever unto God. And what is perfection except it's the taking away of sin? So the old covenant could not take away sin because it was the sacrifice offered was not worthy. It pointed to Christ. But when Christ came, his sacrifice was worthy and able to present us perfect forever as God's people. Now this is the new covenant. Nowhere does it say that the law was done away with in the new covenant. The law in both covenants remains the same, unchanged. It stays there. The law is still there in both covenants. What the only difference, the only thing that changes between the old covenant and the new covenant is the offering of sacrifices. And that in the old covenant, lambs and animals were sacrificed, pointing to Christ. In the new covenant, Christ himself came as that offering. So I hope this helps you to understand the difference between the two covenants, but that the law is still binding, and that Christ's sacrifice, instead of doing away with the law, establishes it and causes us to keep that law, because that law is the law of love. It's the law of God's character. In Jesus, I pray that this might be a blessing to you. Amen.